nearly 20,000 black people were stripped of their Native American identity by the United States government, and nobody talks about it. I need you to hear that number again. 20,000. These weren't random people claiming something they had no right to claim. These were people who had lived among the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole for generations. Some of them had Native parents. Some of them had Native grandparents. Some of them spoke the language, practiced the customs, married into the tribe, and raised children who knew no other life. And between 1893 and 1907, government clerks sat at tables, looked at their skin, and said, "No, you're not Indian. You're freedmen. You go on a different list." And with the stroke of a pen, they erased an entire population of black Native Americans from existence. Your great-grandmother might be on one of those lists. Your grandfather might have been one of those people. And you would never know because they made sure you wouldn't know. See, here's what they don't teach you in school. Black people and Native Americans have been mixing since before this country existed. We're talking about the 1500s. When the first African slaves escaped from Spanish colonies, where do you think they went? They ran into the wilderness. They ran into the swamps. They ran to the people who already lived there. And the native tribes, many of them, didn't turn those runaways back over. They took them in. They gave them shelter. They gave them community. And over time, they gave them family. Africans married Native Americans. They had children together. Those children grew up not as one or the other, but as both. For hundreds of years, this mixing happened across the entire Southeast. It was common, it was accepted, it was normal. And then America decided it needed to stop. The 5 civilized tribes is what they called them. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. These 5 nations controlled most of what we now call the American Southeast. Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida. This was their land. And within these nations, there were thousands of black people. Some were enslaved, yes. The tribes had adopted slavery from the Europeans they traded with. But many were free. Many were mixed. Many were fully integrated members of the tribe with all the rights that came with it. An 1835 census of the Cherokee Nation found that 10% of the population had African descent. 10%. And here's the key. In those days, the tribe counted those mixed people as Cherokee. If you had Cherokee blood and you lived among the Cherokee, you were Cherokee. The African part didn't disqualify you. That was the rule. That was how it worked. Until America decided to change the rules. In the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson, the same man whose face is on the $20 bill, signed the Indian Removal Act. This law forced the 5 tribes to leave their ancestral lands and march over 1,000 miles to what they called Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. You know this as the Trail of Tears. What you might not know is that black people walked that trail too. Between 8,000 and 10,000 black people, enslaved by members of the 5 tribes, were forced to make that same brutal journey. They suffered the same cold. They faced the same starvation. They buried their dead in the same unmarked graves along the way. They were not separate from this tragedy. They were part of it. And when they arrived in Indian Territory, they didn't stop being part of the tribes. They kept living together. They kept marrying. They kept building families that blurred the lines between African and Native. For another 30 years, this continued. Then the Civil War happened. And after the war, everything changed. The 5 tribes had sided with the Confederacy. When the South lost, the U.S. government demanded new treaties. And one of the conditions of those treaties signed in 1866 was that the tribes had to free their slaves and grant them full citizenship. The freedmen, as they were called, were supposed to become equal members of the tribe with all the same rights to land and money. That was the deal. That was signed on paper. And for a while, it was honored. Freedmen got land allotments. Freedmen voted in tribal elections. Freedmen sent their children to tribal schools. They were citizens, legally, officially, on paper. And then the government decided to rewrite everything. In 1893, Congress created something called the Dawes Commission. The official purpose was to break up tribal land ownership and distribute it to individual families. Every citizen of the 5 tribes would get their own plot of land. But to do that, they needed a list of who was a citizen. So the commission started enrolling people. They set up tables in Indian Territory, and people came to register. And this is where the theft happened. This is where they stole Black Native identity and buried it so deep that most people today don't even know it was taken. The Dawes Commission created 3 categories: Cherokee by blood, intermarried white, and freedmen. If you were listed as Cherokee by blood, you were officially Native American. Your descendants could claim tribal membership forever. If you were intermarried white, you were a white person who had married into the tribe. Still counted, still got benefits. But if you were freedmen, even if your mother was Cherokee, even if your father was full-blood Creek, even if you had more Native ancestry than some of the people on the blood rolls, you were put on a separate list, the freedmen list. And that list didn't record blood quantum. That list didn't acknowledge Native ancestry. That list treated you as if you were purely African, with no connection to the tribe except that you had been enslaved by them. It was a lie. And they knew it was a lie when they did it. The registrars didn't ask questions. They didn't investigate family histories. They looked at you. If your skin was dark, if your features looked African to their eyes, you went on the freedman roll, period. It didn't matter if your grandmother was full-blood Cherokee and sitting right next to you. It didn't matter if you could speak the language fluently while some of the so-called blood citizens couldn't. It didn't matter if you had documentation proving your Native ancestry. If you looked Black, you were freedmen. The whole process took from 1898 to 1907. When it was done, the Dawes rolls listed nearly 42,000 citizens of the Cherokee Nation. Of those, almost 5,000 were listed separately as freedmen. And across all 5 tribes, the number was close to 20,000 people. 20,000 Black Native Americans stripped of their Native identity by a bureaucratic system designed to divide them from their own families. And the cruelest part, there are documented cases of siblings being placed on different roles. Same mother, same father. One sibling looked more Native, got listed as Cherokee by blood. The other sibling looked more African, got listed as freedmen. Same family, same blood, different categories. There are cases of people with one Cherokee grandparent being listed as Cherokee by blood, while other people with one Cherokee parent were listed only as freedmen because of how dark their skin was. The system was arbitrary. It was racist. And it determined the fate of generations. Because once you were on the freedman roll, your children were freedmen. Your grandchildren were freedmen. Your great-grandchildren, all the way down to today, carry that designation. And for most of the 20th century, that designation meant you were not considered a real member of the tribe. Let me tell you what that meant in practical terms. When the tribes got money from the government, from land settlements, from oil rights, from casino revenue, their freedmen descendants were often cut out. When the tribes offered services, healthcare, education, housing assistance, the freedmen descendants were told they didn't qualify. When the tribes reasserted their sovereignty and rewrote their constitutions, many of them specifically excluded freedmen descendants from citizenship. The Cherokee did it in 2007. They voted to remove freedmen descendants from the tribe entirely. After 140 years of being citizens, after their ancestors walked the Trail of Tears, after their families helped build the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, the tribe voted them out. And the only reason they're back in now is because federal courts ruled that the 1866 treaty still applies. The tribe had to take them back, not because the tribe wanted to, but because a court made them. This is not ancient history. This is happening right now. Freedmen descendants are still fighting for recognition. They're still going to court. They're still being told by some tribal members that they don't belong because their ancestors were put on the wrong list by racist clerks over 100 years ago. The Chickasaw Nation has never granted citizenship to freedmen descendants, ever, to this day, despite the 1866 treaty. Despite the shared history, the door remains closed, and most Americans have no idea this is even happening because this story isn't taught. This history isn't told. The Black Indians of the 5 tribes were erased once by the Dawes Commission, and they've been erased again by the silence that followed. So if your family has stories about Native ancestry, if your grandmother told you there was Cherokee in the bloodline, if you did one of those DINA tests and it showed a percentage of Native American that you couldn't explain, now you might understand why. You might come from people who were counted as Native American before 1898 and then uncounted afterward. You might come from people who lived as Cherokee or Creek or Choctaw for generations and then had that identity taken away by a government clerk who looked at their skin and made a decision in 30 seconds that erased centuries of heritage. The Dawes rolls are still the primary document used to determine tribal citizenship. If your ancestor is on the blood roll, you can claim membership. If your ancestor is on the freedman roll, in many tribes, you cannot. The paperwork matters more than the blood. The list matters more than the truth. And the truth is that Black and Native were never meant to be separate categories. America made them separate. America built walls between people who had been family for hundreds of years. And then America pretended those walls had always been there. Let me take you to Florida, because this is where the story gets bloody, and this is where Black people stopped waiting for freedom and started fighting for it. The Seminoles were different from the other tribes. They were actually a mix of different native groups. Creek people who had moved south, remnants of other tribes, and they had a relationship with Black people that set them apart. When African slaves escaped from the plantations of Georgia and South Carolina, many of them ran south. They ran to Florida, which was controlled by Spain, and they ran to the Seminoles, who didn't just tolerate them, they welcomed them. They formed alliances with them. They fought alongside them. And eventually, they became one people. The Black Seminoles, they called them. Maroons, escaped slaves who had combined African traditions with Native American ways of life. They built their own communities in the Florida swamps. They farmed. They raised cattle. They trained with weapons. And they refused to be taken back into slavery. By the early 1800s, there were hundreds of free Black people living in Florida under Seminole protection, and this terrified the slave states. Georgia looked at Florida and saw a sanctuary. They saw escaped property living in freedom just across the border. They saw a threat to the entire system of slavery. Because if slaves knew there was a place to run to, a place where Black people lived free and armed and protected, more of them would try. The existence of the Black Seminoles was an invitation to rebellion. and America decided to destroy them. In 1816, there was a place called Negro Fort. It sat on the Apalachicola River in Spanish Florida. The British had built it during the War of 1812 and armed T with cannons and muskets and ammunition. When the British left after the war ended, they didn't take the weapons with them. They left them for the people living there. And who was living there? Over 300 black men, women, and children. Free black people, armed black people, people who had escaped slavery and built a life in the Florida wilderness. They had cannons. They had over 2,500 muskets. They had powder and shot, and they had no intention of going back to bondage. Negro Fort was the largest community of free armed black people in North America at that time. Think about that. 1816. Slavery is the law of the land across the American South. Millions of black people are in chains. And here in Spanish Florida, there's a fort full of black people with enough firepower to hold off an army. The slave states couldn't tolerate it. General Andrew Jackson, the same man who would later force the Trail of Tears, ordered the fort destroyed. He didn't have permission from Spain. He didn't have a declaration of war. He just sent American troops into a foreign country to wipe out a community of free black people. On July 27, 1816, American gunboats came up the Apalachicola River. The people in the fort saw them coming. They could have surrendered. They could have tried to negotiate. They didn't. They opened fire. They chose to fight. And for a while, they held their own. But then one of the American gunboats heated a cannonball until it glowed red and fired it into the fort. It landed in the powder magazine. The explosion was heard for miles. Over 270 people died instantly. Men, women, and children gone in a flash of fire. The survivors, around 60 people, were captured. Most of them were returned to slavery. The leaders were executed on the spot. This was the first and only time in American history that the United States military destroyed a community of free black people in another country. Spain protested. They called it an act of war. But nothing happened. Nobody was punished. Andrew Jackson was celebrated. And the message was sent loud and clear. There is nowhere you can run. There is no fort strong enough. There is no foreign border that will protect you. If you are black and free and armed, America will find you and destroy you. That was the lesson of Negro Fort. And the Black Seminoles learned it. But they didn't give up. They went deeper into the swamps. They joined more closely with the native Seminoles, and they prepared for the war they knew was coming. The First Seminole War started in 1817, just a year after Negro Fort was destroyed. Andrew Jackson invaded Florida again, this time with a larger force. He burned Seminole villages. He burned Black Seminole villages. He captured Spanish forts. He executed anyone he considered a threat. By 1819, Spain had enough. They sold Florida to the United States rather than keep fighting over it. And now, the Black Seminoles had nowhere left to run. The swamps that had protected them were now American territory. The laws of slavery now applied to them. And the pressure to remove both native Seminoles and Black Seminoles to Indian territory began immediately. But the Seminoles didn't go quietly. The Second Seminole War, which started in 1835, was the longest and most expensive Indian war in American history. It lasted 7 years. It cost the United States over $40 million, an astronomical sum at the time. It killed over 1,500 American soldiers. And at the heart of the Seminole resistance were black warriors. General Thomas Sidney Jesup, who commanded American forces in Florida, wrote it plainly. He said, "This is a Negro war, not an Indian war. He understood what the history books would later try to hide. The Black Seminoles weren't just along for the ride. They were leaders. They were strategists. They were some of the fiercest fighters the American military had ever faced. Let me tell you about a man named John Horse, because his story deserves to be known. John Horse was born around 1812. His mother was African. His father was likely mixed Seminole and Spanish. He grew up in the Florida swamps, in the Black Seminole communities that existed there. He spoke multiple languages: English, Spanish, Muskogee, probably others. He was smart, he was charismatic, and he was absolutely fearless. By the time the Second Seminole War started, John Horse was in his early 20s and already a recognized leader among his people. John Horse fought in some of the most important battles of the war. The Battle of Okeechobee in 1837 was one of the largest engagements of the entire conflict. American forces under Colonel Zachary Taylor, who would later become president, attacked a combined force of Seminoles and Black Seminoles. John Horse was there. The Seminole forces were outnumbered, but they held their ground in the sawgrass and cypress swamps. They inflicted heavy casualties on the American troops before withdrawing. It wasn't a clear victory for either side, but it proved that the Seminoles could stand and fight against the U.S. Army and survive. What made John Horse remarkable wasn't just his fighting ability, it was his leadership and his vision. He understood that the war couldn't be won militarily. The United States had too many soldiers, too many resources, but he also understood that his people didn't have to lose everything. He negotiated. He talked to American generals. He tried to secure the best possible terms for his people. And in 1838, he achieved something that seemed impossible. He got a promise from General Jessup that Black Seminoles who surrendered would not be returned to slavery. They would be allowed to relocate to Indian Territory as free people alongside the native Seminoles. This was unprecedented. The entire point of the war, from the American perspective, was to return escaped slaves to their owners. Plantation owners from Georgia and other states were demanding their property back. And here was an American general promising freedom to those same escaped slaves. It caused an uproar. Jessup was criticized. The promise was challenged. But John Horse held the Americans to their word. He led hundreds of Black Seminoles to Indian Territory, not as slaves, but as free people. It was the largest emancipation of enslaved people in American history before the Civil War. And it happened not because America had a change of heart, but because Black and Native people fought so hard and so long that freeing them was easier than continuing the war. But the story doesn't end there. Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, wasn't the paradise they had hoped for. The Creek Nation, which had authority over some of the Seminole lands, tried to enslave the Black Seminoles. Slaveholders from the South sent agents to kidnap Black Seminoles and drag them back to bondage. The promises made by General Jessup were ignored by local authorities. John Horse and his people found themselves fighting the same battles all over again, just in a different place. So John Horse made a decision that most people would have thought was crazy. He decided to leave the United States entirely. In 1849, John Horse and a Seminole leader named Wildcat led a group of Black Seminoles and Native Seminoles south. They crossed the Texas frontier, they crossed the Rio Grande, and they entered Mexico. The Mexican government, which had abolished slavery in 1829, welcomed them. They were given land in the state of Coahuila. They were recognized as free people. And in exchange, they agreed to help protect the Mexican frontier against Comanche and Apache raids. For the next 2 decades, John Horse and the Black Seminoles lived in Mexico as free people. They built communities. They raised families. They served as frontier guards and scouts, and they never went back to slavery. John Horse himself became a respected figure. He met with Mexican presidents. He negotiated land grants. He led military expeditions against raiders. He was a statesman and a warrior and a leader of his people in a foreign land, all because the country of his birth refused to recognize his humanity. The Black Seminoles, who stayed in Mexico, became known as the Mascogos. Their descendants still live in Coahuila today. They still speak a Creole language that blends English, Spanish, and African elements. They still remember their history. They still honor their ancestors who chose freedom over everything else. And most Americans have never heard of them. Most Americans don't know that there's a community of Black people in Mexico who are there because their ancestors fought the United States military to a standstill and then walked to freedom across an international border. After the Civil War, things changed again. The United States Army, now needing scouts who knew the Texas frontier, reached out to the Black Seminoles in Mexico. They offered them a deal. Come back to Texas, serve as Army scouts, and you'll receive land and supplies. Many of the Black Seminoles accepted. They recrossed the Rio Grande and enlisted in the U.S. Army as the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, and they became one of the most effective units in the entire Indian Wars. Between 1870 and 1914, the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts served on the Texas frontier. They tracked down raiders. They protected settlers. They went on missions that other units couldn't handle. And 4 of them earned the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. 4. Adam Payne, Isaac Payne, John Ward, and Pompey Factor. All 4 received the Medal of Honor for a single engagement in 1875, the Battle of the Pecos River, where a small group of scouts fought off a much larger force of Comanche warriors. These men were heroes by any measure, and almost nobody knows their names. The government promised the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts land in exchange for their service. The government lied. For decades, the scouts and their families petitioned for the land they were promised. They were denied again and again. They lived in poverty on the outskirts of Fort Clark, Texas, in a settlement called Bracketville. They watched white veterans receive their land grants while their own petitions were ignored. Some of them are still fighting for that land today. Their descendants are still petitioning the government to honor a promise made over 150 years ago. Full script, part 3, the erasure. Now let me take you back to Indian Territory, because this is where the theft happened. This is where the government systematically erased Black Native identity and created divisions that still exist today. You need to understand what the Dawes rolls were and how they worked, because this is the root of everything. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act. The official reason was to help Native Americans assimilate into American society by giving them individual land ownership instead of communal tribal ownership. The real reason was to break up the reservations and open native land to white settlers. Under the old system, tribes owned their land collectively. You couldn't buy a piece of the Cherokee Nation because the Cherokee Nation owned it all together. But if you divided that land into individual plots and gave each tribal citizen their own piece, suddenly there was leftover land. Surplus land, land that could be sold to white settlers. That was the plan all along. To divide the land, the government needed to know who was a citizen of each tribe. So in 1893, Congress created the Dawes Commission and sent them to Indian Territory to make a list. Every citizen of the 5 civilized tribes would be enrolled. Every enrolled citizen would receive an allotment of land, and whatever land was left over would be open to white settlement. It sounded straightforward It wasn't. The Dawes Commission showed up in Indian Territory and immediately faced a problem. The 5 tribes had already been living with black people for generations. Some of those black people were former slaves. Some of them were free people who had married into the tribe. Some of them were mixed, with African and Native ancestry going back 100 years or more. The tribes themselves had recognized many of these people as citizens with full rights. The 1866 treaties required them to. But the Dawes Commission looked at this situation and decided to sort everyone into neat racial categories. They created the roles I told you about before. Cherokee by blood, Cherokee freedmen. The blood roll was for people the commission considered racially Native American. The freedman roll was for people the commission considered racially African. And here's the key. The blood roll recorded blood quantum. It noted whether you were full blood, half blood, quarter blood, whatever. The freedman roll did not. The freedman roll treated everyone on it as if they had 0 Native ancestry. Even if your mother was full-blood Cherokee, even if your father was a Creek warrior, if you were put on the freedman roll, your Native ancestry was not recorded. It was erased. It was as if it didn't exist. The registrars who made these decisions were white men from the United States. They didn't know the people they were enrolling. They didn't speak the tribal languages. They didn't understand the complex family relationships that existed in Indian Territory. What they understood was what they could see with their eyes. If you looked native to them, you went on the blood roll. If you looked black to them, you went on the freedman roll. It was that simple and that racist. There's a story that gets told in freedmen families. A woman shows up to enroll with her children. She's light-skinned, clearly mixed, could pass for native. Her children are darker. The registrar looks at them. He puts the mother on the blood roll as Cherokee by blood. He puts her own children on the freedman roll. Same family, same mother, different roles. The children's native ancestry, which came directly from the woman standing right there, was not recorded. They were freedmen. Their descendants would be freedmen forever. And their mother's descendants, if they came from a different, lighter-skinned child, would be Cherokee by blood forever. This happened over and over and over again. Families were split by the stroke of a pen. Brothers and sisters ended up on different roles based on nothing but skin color. People who had lived as Cherokee their whole lives, who spoke Cherokee, who participated in Cherokee government, were suddenly told they weren't really Cherokee. They were just freedmen, just former slaves, no blood connection, no ancestry worth recording. And the consequences were immediate. When the land allotments were distributed, freedmen received their plots. That part was honored, mostly. But when it came to everything else, the blood citizens had priority. When money was distributed from land sales, the blood citizens got more. When services were provided, the blood citizens came first. And as the decades passed and the tribes reorganized and rewrote their constitutions, many of them used the Dawes rolls as the basis for citizenship. If your ancestor was on the blood roll, you could be a citizen. If your ancestor was on the freedman roll, in many tribes, you could not. The Cherokee Nation wrote a new constitution in 1975. Under that constitution, citizenship was limited to descendants of people on the Dawes rolls by blood. Freedmen descendants were not included. For over 30 years, freedmen descendants were denied citizenship and a nation their ancestors had helped build. They couldn't vote in tribal elections. They couldn't run for tribal office. They couldn't access tribal services. They were outsiders in their own homeland. In 2007, the Cherokee Nation held a special election. The question on the ballot was whether to amend the Constitution to require Cherokee blood for citizenship formally and permanently excluding freedmen descendants. The measure passed. Over 75% of Cherokee voters said yes, kick the freedmen out. It was devastating. Freedmen families who had been fighting for recognition for over a century were told, once again, that they didn't belong. But the freedmen didn't give up. They never gave up. They took the case to federal court. They argued that the 1866 treaty, the one that granted citizenship to freedmen after the Civil War, was still in effect. They argued that the Cherokee Nation couldn't unilaterally revoke citizenship that had been guaranteed by a treaty with the United States government. And in 2017, they won. A federal court ruled that the 1866 treaty was binding. Freedmen descendants were entitled to citizenship in the Cherokee Nation, whether the tribe liked it or not. It was a victory, but it was a bitter one. The freedmen had to go to federal court to force the tribe to accept them. The tribe didn't welcome them back with open arms. Many Cherokee citizens still resent the decision. The wounds are still fresh. The divisions that the Dawes Commission created over 100 years ago are still tearing at the fabric of the Cherokee Nation today. And the Cherokee aren't alone. The Creek Nation, the Choctaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, and the Seminole Nation all have their own histories with freedmen. Some have been more welcoming than others. The Seminole Nation, despite the shared history of Black Seminoles fighting alongside Native Seminoles for decades, has had its own battles over freedmen citizenship. The Chickasaw Nation has never granted citizenship to freedmen descendants, ever, despite the treaty, despite the shared history. The door remains closed. Let me tell you about Marilyn Vann, because her story represents what so many freedmen families have gone through. Marilyn Vann is a freedman descendant. Her ancestors were enslaved by the Cherokee. They walked the Trail of Tears. They were freed after the Civil War and granted citizenship under the 1866 treaty. They received land allotments under the Dawes Act. They lived as Cherokee citizens for generations. And then in 1983, Marilyn Vann was told she couldn't be a citizen of the Cherokee Nation because her ancestors were on the wrong roll. Marilyn Vann didn't accept that. She started fighting. She organized other freedmen descendants. She formed the Descendants of Freedmen of the Five Civilized Tribes Association. She lobbied Congress. She filed lawsuits. She testified before committees. For over 30 years, she fought, and she won. She was one of the lead plaintiffs in the case that forced the Cherokee Nation to restore freedmen citizenship in 2017. But she had to fight for 3 decades to claim what should have been hers by right since 1866. That's what erasure looks like. It's not just being left out of the history books. It's being told that your own family history is a lie. It's being told that the identity your grandparents claimed isn't real. It's having to go to federal court to prove that you exist. It's fighting for 30 years to be recognized by people whose ancestors fought alongside yours. Erasure isn't just silence. Erasure is active denial. And the freedmen have been fighting against that denial for over a century. So where does that leave us today? What does all of this mean for you, sitting there, listening to this? Maybe you have family stories about Native ancestry. Maybe your grandmother told you there was Cherokee in the bloodline. Maybe you took a DINA test and it showed Native American percentage and you didn't know where it came from. Or maybe it didn't show anything at all and you figured the family stories were just stories. Let me tell you something about that. DINA tests are complicated. They can tell you about genetic ancestry, but they can't tell you about identity. They can't tell you about culture. They can't tell you about who your ancestors lived with, who they married, who they considered family. The tests compare your DINA to reference populations, and those reference populations are imperfect. They don't include every group. They don't capture every mixture. If your ancestors were Black Seminoles who had been mixing African native and European blood for 200 years, the test might not know what to do with that. It might assign percentages that don't make sense. It might miss the native ancestry entirely because the reference populations don't include people like your ancestors. And even if the DINA test shows native ancestry, it doesn't give you tribal citizenship. That's the cruel irony. Tribes determine their own citizenship requirements, and almost all of them require documented descent from someone on a historical roll. The Dawes rolls, the Baker roll, whatever roll applies to that particular tribe. Nah isn't enough. You need paper. You need a name. You need to trace your family back to a specific person on a specific list. And if your ancestor was put on the freedman roll instead of the blood roll, that paper might not help you. The DINA in your veins might be native, but the document says freedman, and the document is what matters. This is the legacy of what was done. It's not just historical, it's ongoing. The categories that were created to divide people in the 1890s are still dividing people today. The roles that were written by racist clerks are still determining who belongs and who doesn't. The erasure that happened over a century ago is still in effect because nobody has fully undone it. But here's what I want you to understand. The categories were always a lie. Black and Native were never meant to be separate. For hundreds of years, before the United States government decided to sort everyone into boxes, people lived together. They married. They had children. They fought together. They suffered together. They resisted together. The Black Seminoles, who held Negro fort, weren't confused about their identity. They knew who they were. They were free people. They were warriors. They were Seminoles. The name didn't need a color in front of it to make sense to them. The people who walked the Trail of Tears together, Black and Native, they didn't need a clerk to tell them who their family was. They knew. The children knew who their parents were. The parents knew who their children were. The community knew who belonged and who didn't. The government came in with their categories and their roles and their blood quantum formulas and tried to replace lived reality with bureaucratic fiction. And they succeeded, partly. They succeeded in dividing people. They succeeded in creating conflicts that still exist today. But they didn't succeed in erasing the truth entirely, because the truth has a way of surviving. The truth is that millions of Black Americans have Native ancestry, not because of some romantic myth, not because of family legends that might or might not be true, but because of documented, verifiable history. Thousands of Black people were on the rolls of the 5 civilized tribes. Thousands more lived among other tribes in other parts of the country, mixing and marrying and having children over the course of centuries. The mixing happened. It's real. And no amount of bureaucratic erasure can change what actually occurred. The truth is that Black people fought for Native rights, and Native people sheltered Black freedom seekers. Not always. Not everywhere. The relationship was complicated. Some tribes enslaved Black people. Some Black people fought against tribes as part of the U.S. military. The history isn't simple, but the history also includes alliance and kinship and shared resistance. It includes Negro Fort and the Seminole Wars. It includes maroon communities and intermarriage. It includes families that were Black and Native at the same time, because those categories only make sense to people who need everyone sorted into boxes. The truth is that the American government deliberately tried to divide Black and Native people because united, they were dangerous. A coalition of black and native resistance was Andrew Jackson's nightmare. It was every slaveholder's nightmare. People who knew the land, who could disappear into swamps and forests, who had weapons and training and nothing to lose, united with people who had been brutalized by slavery and were willing to die rather than go back. That coalition almost won. It held off the U.S. military for years. It forced generals to make promises they didn't want to make. And when the military couldn't defeat it completely, the government tried a different tactic. Division. Separate the black from the native. Put them on different roles. Give them different statuses. Make them fight each other instead of the common enemy. That was the strategy. And it worked well enough to break the coalition. But it didn't erase the blood. It didn't erase the families. It didn't erase the history. So what do you do with this knowledge? How do you carry this forward? Let me suggest a few things. First, learn your own history, not the history they teach in schools. Your history, your family's history. Talk to the elders while they're still here. Ask about the old stories. Find out what names have been passed down. Look at the Dawes rolls yourself. They're online. They're searchable. You can type in family names and see if your ancestors are there. You might be surprised. You might find ancestors you never knew about listed on rolls you never knew existed. Second, understand that identity is complicated, and that's okay. You don't have to choose between being black and having native ancestry. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. If your family has history with native peoples, that history is real whether or not it shows up on a DINA test, whether or not it qualifies you for tribal enrollment. The bureaucratic categories are not the final word on who you are. They're just the categories that people in power created to manage populations. Your identity is bigger than a box on a form. Third, support the people who are still fighting. Freedmen descendants are still in court. They're still lobbying Congress. They're still pushing for recognition and rights that were promised to them over 150 years ago. Organizations like the Descendants of Freedmen of the Five Civilized Tribes are doing this work right now. You can learn about them. You can support them. You can amplify their voices. Their fight is part of your history too, whether or not you have direct lineage. Fourth, remember that the division between black and native serves a purpose, and it's not your purpose. It serves the purpose of people who benefit when oppressed groups fight each other instead of working together. Every time black and native communities are at odds over resources or recognition or identity, somebody else benefits. The same people who created the divisions in the first place. Unity is dangerous to them. Solidarity is dangerous to them. Remembering that we were once family, that we fought together, that we bled together, that's dangerous to them. So remember, the Black Seminoles remembered. When they crossed into Mexico and built new lives, they remembered who they were. When they came back and served as Army Scouts, they remembered. Their descendants in Brackettville, Texas, and Nacimiento, Mexico, still remember. They hold ceremonies. They keep the language alive. They tell the stories. They refuse to let the erasure be complete. The freedmen remembered. Through 100 years of being told they didn't belong, they remembered. They kept the documents. They passed down the family trees. They fought in court and in Congress and in tribal council meetings. They refused to accept the category they were assigned. They insisted on their full identity. And now you know. Now you remember too. Not because someone sat you down in a classroom and taught you, but because the truth has a way of coming out. Because stories survive. Because the people who were erased keep showing up and demanding to be seen. Because no matter how many times the powerful try to divide the powerless, Somebody always remembers that we weren't always divided. Somebody always remembers Negro Fort. Somebody always remembers John Horse and Wildcat crossing into Mexico. Somebody always remembers the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts and their 4 Medals of Honor. Somebody always remembers the Trail of Tears and the black people who walked it. Somebody always remembers that the first time they saw a black person and a native person, they thought those were 2 different things. But the history says otherwise. The history says we were family. The history says we fought together. The history says they had to work hard to make us forget. Don't forget. Don't let the erasure win. Don't let the categories define you. You come from people who refused to be enslaved, who ran into swamps and built forts and fought the United States Army to a standstill. You come from people who walked 1,000 miles and buried their dead along the way and started over in a strange land. You come from people who were told they didn't belong and spent 100 years proving they did. That's your heritage. That's your blood. No matter what role your ancestors were put on, no matter what box gets checked on a form, no matter what a nah test does or doesn't say, the truth is in the history. The truth is in the stories. The truth is in the names on old documents and the bones in unmarked graves and the descendants who are still fighting right now. And now the truth is with you. What you do with it is your choice. But you can't say you didn't know. You can't say nobody told you. The hidden black Indians of America were never actually hidden. They were just ignored. They were just erased. They were just waiting for someone to look at the evidence and say out loud what the evidence clearly shows. Black and Native were family. Black and Native were allies. Black and Native were one people in places and times that have been deliberately forgotten. And remembering that, honoring that, carrying that forward, that's how you fight erasure. Not just for yourself, for everyone who was put on the wrong road, for everyone who was told their ancestry didn't count, for everyone who knew who they were and got told by a government clerk that they were something else. You remember for them. You speak for them. You make sure their story doesn't die. Because stories don't die easily. They go underground. They get whispered in families. They get passed down in fragments. And then one day, somebody puts the fragments together and realizes what they're looking at. That's what happened here. That's what happened today. The fragments came together. The story is whole again. And now it belongs to you. Do something with it. Tell somebody. Write it down. Look up your family. Ask the questions. Find the documents. Connect with others who are searching for the same truth. The hidden Black American Indians aren't hidden anymore. They never should have been hidden in the first place. And now that you know, you're part of making sure they never get hidden again. That's the work. That's the responsibility. That's what you do when somebody hands you truth that was stolen from your ancestors. You hold on to it. You protect it. You pass it on. And you refuse, absolutely refuse, to let anyone take it away again.